I sold her the seeds on a Thursday. I remember it was a Thursday because Thursday was the day the supply wagon came up from Billings, and I had been in the back room all morning taking stock of what had arrived and what had not, which in the autumn of 1885 was a longer list than I like to think about. November had come early that year. The first hard frost had already taken what remained of the kitchen gardens along the creek road, and the women who came into my store that week had the particular look that Montana women get in early November, not afraid exactly, but measuring, calculating what they had against what they would need, doing arithmetic in their heads that I did not envy. Nora Holt came in around 2 in the afternoon. I heard the bell above the door and came out from the back, and there she was, standing in the middle of the store with her coat still buttoned and her hat pulled down over her ears the way she always wore it, winter or otherwise. She was 36 years old that year, though she looked older than that in the way that women who work their own land tend to look older, not worn out, but concentrated, like wood that has been cured properly. She had gray in her hair already, more on the left side than the right for some reason I never understood. Her hands, when she set them on the counter, were the hands of someone who had spent the last 2 years doing the work of 2 people. She did not say good afternoon. Nora Holt was not a woman who spent words on things that were self-evident. She said, lettuce, kale, spinach, winter density varieties if you have them, and whatever you carry for radishes. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at the window where the November sky was the color of a bruise, and the bare cottonwoods along the creek road were bending in a wind that had come down from the north with serious intentions. It's November, I said. I'm aware of that. Nobody plants in November, not in Montana. She looked at me with an expression I would come to know well over the following years. Not impatient, not unkind, but wholly finished with the conversation she was not having. I didn't ask for your opinion on the calendar, Edmund. I asked for seeds. I sold her 5 packets, 25 cents. She laid the coins on the counter one at a time, the way she did everything, deliberately, without waste, picked up the packets, and walked out into the November cold without another word. I watched her go. I thought she was wasting her money. That was 46 years ago. I have thought about those 25 cents more times than I can count. My name is Edmund Crale. I am 74 years old, and I have lived in Harlan's Crossing, Montana for 51 of those years, which is long enough to have watched this valley change from something that felt like the edge of the possible into something that feels, on most mornings, like the quiet aftermath of a long argument that nobody quite won. The store I am sitting in has been closed for 2 years. I keep the keys because I cannot bring myself to hand them over to anyone. Some habits are harder to break than leases. The young woman sitting across from me has driven 70 miles from Helena on roads that were not designed for the automobile she is driving, and she has done so because her editor at the Independent Record has assigned her a story about frontier communities that are fading, and someone told her that if she wanted to understand what Harlan's Crossing was and what it became, she should find Edmund Crale before Edmund Crale was no longer findable. Her name is Alice Marsh. She is 26 years old, and she asks questions the way a person asks questions when they genuinely want to know the answer, which is rarer than you might think. She has asked me about Nora Holt. Most people who ask about Nora Holt want a particular kind of story. They want the story of a plucky widow who proved the doubters wrong. They want the story tidy and the ending triumphant and the lesson clear enough to fit on a sampler. I understand the appeal of that story. I have been telling a version of it for years at church socials and county meetings when someone asks about the early days of this valley. But Alice Marsh has driven 70 miles on bad roads. So I am going to tell her the true version, which is less tidy and more interesting, and which requires me to account honestly for my own part in it, which has not always been a comfortable accounting. Let me start with the winter. You have to understand the winter before you can understand anything else. Montana winters are not dramatic in the way that people who have not lived through them tend to imagine. There is nothing theatrical about them. They do not announce themselves with spectacle. They arrive the way serious things arrive, quietly, with complete intention, and without any particular interest in whether you are prepared. The Valley of Harlan's Crossing sits at roughly 4,000 feet of elevation, cradled on three sides by the first ridges of the Rockies and open on the south to the great sweep of the high plains. What this means, in practical terms, is that the wind has a long, clear run at you from October until April, and the temperature in a serious winter can drop to 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit and stay there for weeks at a stretch. The snow does not fall so much as it accumulates, patient and relentless, building from the ground up rather than the sky down, until it reaches the eaves of a well-built cabin and the door opens inward against a white wall that has to be dug out before anyone can go anywhere. In such winters, which came every 4 or 5 years with the reliability of an unwelcome relative, the question of food became very simple and very serious. There were no fresh vegetables from November until April or May. There were no supply wagons from Billings when the roads drifted over. There was no railroad service for civilian freight when the military and the mining operations needed the lines. There was what you had put up in September, and what you had stored in the root cellar, and what the deer and the rabbits provided if you were lucky and skilled, and nothing else. People managed. That is what people on the frontier did. They managed, which is a small word for a large and often brutal activity. But managing in a Montana winter meant that children went without green vegetables from the time the frost came until the time it lifted, which was 5 or 6 months of every year. It meant that the diseases of nutritional deficiency, the ones with the old-fashioned names that sound almost quaint until you see them, were not unusual. It meant that old people sometimes sat down to rest in January and did not get up again, and that this was understood as the natural order of things rather than as a failure that might have been prevented. This was the problem. It was not a dramatic problem. It was the kind of problem that had existed for so long that most people had stopped seeing it as a problem and had reclassified it as weather, as winter, as the way things were in Montana and the way they would always be. Nora Holt saw it differently. She had come to the valley in 1881 with her husband James, who was a Wisconsin man with 160 acres of homestead claim and a methodical temperament that expressed itself, among other ways, in the keeping of extremely precise records. James Holt recorded everything: rainfall by the quarter inch, temperature at dawn and at midday and at dusk, the date of first frost each autumn, the date of last frost each spring, the color of the soil in the creek bottom compared to the soil on the south-facing hill, the depth at which the ground froze solid in a hard winter, and the depth at which it did not freeze at all. That last entry is the one that mattered. James Holt died of typhoid fever in August of 1883, 2 years and 4 months after he arrived in this valley. He was 38 years old. He left behind 160 acres of partially broken land, a house that was more cabin than house, a small herd of cattle that did not know enough to survive a serious Montana winter without considerable human assistance, and 4 journals filled with the careful observations of a man who had been paying close attention to a landscape he would never fully understand. Nora read those journals. She read them the way you read something that matters, not once but many times, in the evenings after the work was done, by the light of the oil lamp, with a pencil in her hand to mark the passages that struck her as significant. She was a teacher by training, or had been before James in Montana, and the particular education of running a homestead alone had expanded her understanding of what knowledge was and what it was for. She knew how to read carefully. She knew how to ask the question underneath the question. The entry that occupied her longest was from October of 1882, the autumn before James died, when he had noted, in his plain recording instrument prose, that the soil temperature on the south-facing slope at a depth of 4 feet had read 51 degrees Fahrenheit, On a morning when the air temperature was 23 degrees and the surface of the ground was frozen solid to a depth of 6 inches, 51 degrees, 4 feet down. When the surface was frozen, James had noted it and moved on, because James was recording observations, not drawing conclusions. But Nora sat with that entry for a long time. She sat with it across 3 winters of managing alone, which gave her a great deal of time for sitting and thinking, because the community of Harlan's Crossing had made it quietly and efficiently clear that Nora Holt's situation was her own concern. This requires some explanation, because it was not a simple thing. Nobody in Harlan's Crossing was cruel to Nora Holt. I want to be precise about that, because imprecision about this particular subject has allowed me to feel better about myself for 40 years longer than I deserved. Nobody said unkind things to her face. Nobody turned her away from the church or refused to acknowledge her on the road into town. The men tipped their hats. The women asked after her health. I sold her what she needed at fair prices. What the community of Harlan's Crossing did was simpler and more effective than cruelty. We simply made ourselves unavailable. When a widow alone on 160 acres needed a second pair of hands to lift something, or a neighbor's judgment about whether the creek would flood the south pasture, or the ordinary small assistance that frontier life required people to extend to each other as a matter of survival, she found that her neighbors had other obligations. Nothing that could be pointed to. Nothing that could be named. Just a persistent, frictionless unavailability that communicated as clearly as any spoken sentence that Nora Holt had made choices that placed her outside the ordinary network of mutual aid. The choice that had done it was a legal matter involving water rights. In the summer of 1884, Harlan Goss, who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley and after whom the town's post office, if not the town itself, was somewhat reluctantly named, had diverted the small creek that ran through the eastern edge of Nora's land to irrigate his south pasture. It was not a legal diversion. Nora had the water rights documentation to prove it, acquired when James filed the original homestead claim. She did not ask anyone's opinion. She did not send a man to speak for her. She rode to the county seat herself, returned with a certified copy of the water permit, and set it on Harlan Goss's kitchen table in front of him and 2 of his ranch hands and his foreman, and told him she wanted the creek returned to its original course before the end of the month. The creek was returned. The water flowed back across Nora's land within the week. Harlan Goss was a man who understood legal documents, and he understood when he had been caught doing something he should not have been doing, and he moved accordingly. But he was also a man who did not forget. And in a town that depended on Harlan Goss's goodwill for its economic stability, his memory had a way of becoming the community's memory. That was the context in which Nora Holt spent the winter of 1884 reading James's journals by lamplight, making her own notations in the margins, and trying to understand what a man meant when he wrote that the earth 4 feet down held its warmth even when the surface above it was frozen solid. She was not yet sure what it meant, but she was the kind of person who could not leave a question alone once she had found it. Brother Francis. Had there been a Brother Francis in Nora Holt's life, which there was not, though there had been a schoolmaster in Ohio named Hargreaves who had told her something similar, might have said she had a mind that kept moving. She would have said, more plainly, that she had been cold for 2 winters and she was tired of it, and she thought the ground itself might have something to tell her if she was willing to listen. She was willing to listen. She bought the seeds in November. She had a reason for the seeds. She did not explain the reason to me because I had not asked the right question. I have spent 46 years wishing I had asked. She found Choi Hua by accident, the way most worthwhile discoveries arrive, not by searching for the thing itself, but by following something else with sufficient attention. It was October of 1884, 2 weeks before the first hard frost, and Nora had gone north along the creek to look for a cow that had pushed through a gap in the fence line sometime in the night. The animal had left a clear enough trail through the damp grass, and Nora followed it into the valley that opened up beyond the north ridge of her land, a wider, shallower valley than the one Harlan's Crossing occupied, less settled, given over mostly to the kind of country that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Scrub willow along the water, stands of aspen going yellow, long slopes of native grass running up to the first timber. She found the cow in a shallow draw, standing in the company of 3 other cattle that did not belong to Nora and showing no inclination to go anywhere. She also found, at the far edge of the draw, a woman she had never seen before, crouched near the base of a south-facing hillside with her hands in the grass. They looked at each other across 50 feet of autumn meadow. The woman was Crow, 60 years old or thereabouts, dressed practically in a way that suggested she had been dressing for Montana winters considerably longer than most people in the valley. She did not appear alarmed by Nora's presence. She did not appear particularly interested in it either. She looked at Nora for a moment with the particular quality of assessment that belongs to people who have learned to evaluate strangers quickly and without sentiment, and then she returned her attention to whatever she had been examining in the grass. Nora tied her cow to a willow branch and walked over. What the woman, whose name Nora would learn over subsequent weeks through a process of gradual and mutual communication that relied more on gesture and demonstration than on any shared language, was Choi Hua, a name that translated approximately as standing alone. Though Edmund told Alice Marsh in the spring of 1931 that he had never been sure of that translation and it was possible he had it wrong. What she was doing was lifting a mat of dead grass from the base of the slope and pressing her bare palm into the earth beneath. Nora watched. Then she crouched down beside her and did the same. The earth was warm, not merely less cold than the air above it, which had dropped into the low 30s that morning. Genuinely, noticeably warm. The warmth of something that had been storing heat for a long time and had not yet spent it. The surface of the ground 3 feet away, in the shadow of the willow stand, was cold and damp and would be frozen inside a week. But here, on the south-facing base of this particular slope, with the October sun falling on it at an angle that collected rather than scattered, here the ground gave back warmth like a stone that had been sitting near a fire. Choi Hua watched Nora's face while she felt it. She said nothing. She did not need to. The earth said it clearly enough. Nora walked home that evening with her recovered cow and sat at the kitchen table for a long while before she opened James's 4th journal to the October entry she had been reading since his death. Soil temperature, south slope, 4 feet depth, 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Air temperature, 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Surface, frozen to 6 inches. She read it 3 times. Then she wrote in her own journal, in the small, careful handwriting she used when she was thinking rather than recording, south-facing ground. Warm at depth when surface is frozen, not accident, not variation. Pattern. Why does the south face hold what the north face loses? What is the mechanism? Find the mechanism. She drew a small diagram of the slope angle. Beneath it, she wrote a single word, geometry. That was the beginning. She went back to the North Valley 6 more times over the following 3 weeks, always in the early morning when the contrast between surface cold and subsurface warmth was most pronounced. Choi Hua was there sometimes and not there other times, and when she was there, she and Nora moved through the landscape in a companionship that did not require conversation. 2 women paying attention to the same ground for different reasons that were not, at their foundation, so different after all. On the 4th visit, Nora brought James's medical thermometer. It was the most precise instrument she owned, calibrated to single degrees, designed for measuring fever in human bodies, not temperature gradients in Montana hillsides, but adequate for the purpose. She measured soil temperature at 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, and 4 feet on 3 different south-facing slopes of varying angles and soil compositions, recording each measurement in her journal with the location, the time of day, the air temperature, and the angle of the sun. The numbers confirmed what her hand had already told her. The variation at 1 foot was significant. affected by recent weather, by shade, by the composition of the surface layer. At 2 feet, it smoothed. At 3 feet, it smoothed further. At 4 feet, on every slope she measured, the temperature had stabilized. Not to the same exact number, but within a narrow range, between 46 and 53 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what was happening at the surface above. She wrote, "The cold does not reach 4 feet, not in October, possibly not in January, possibly not at all. James knew this. He wrote it down. He did not know what it meant. Then, I think I know what it means." The collapsed pit was on the eastern boundary of her land, in a shallow depression below a south-facing slope that she had walked past a dozen times without examining closely because it looked, from a distance, like a drainage problem. A low rectangular mound overgrown with grass and mountain sage, one corner caved in, the remnants of a wood-frame structure protruding from the south-facing side like the ribs of something that had lain down and given up. She might never have looked at it carefully if she had not been thinking by that point almost continuously about south-facing slopes and what they held. She pulled away the collapsed timber on the east side and found the opening, not large enough to call a doorway anymore, the frame rotted and the threshold sunken, but passable if she crouched. She brought her lantern inside. The structure was ruined. Whatever roof had been there was gone, replaced by 4 years of accumulated grass and collapsed sod and the patient work of frost heave on the foundation stones. The growing beds along the walls had reverted to ordinary dirt. The south-facing wall, which had once held glass in a wooden frame, was an open gap that let in the October light and the October cold equally. It was not a shelter. It was not useful. It was a lesson in what happened when a sound idea was abandoned before anyone else could learn from it. But the back wall was stone, granite, stacked with care, 3 feet thick at the base. And on the inner face of that stone wall, sheltered by the overhang of the collapsed roof and protected from the worst of the weather by the remaining structure, someone had worked with a knife for what must have been a considerable number of hours. Diagrams, precise, unhurried, deeply cut into the stone face so that even 4 years of weather had not blurred their lines. The angle of the south-facing glass wall, marked with a notation she could not immediately read. The depth of the pit below grade level, with a measurement in unfamiliar units. The thickness of the stone walls. The placement of the growing beds relative to the glass. Small arrows indicating the movement of air. Dotted lines she would spend a week interpreting before she understood they represented the path of winter sunlight at different hours of the day. And at the bottom, in a different script than the diagrams, smaller, more hurried, as if written in a different mood on a different occasion, a single line of text in a language she did not know. She copied the diagrams and the text into her journal with a pencil, working carefully in the thin October light, checking and rechecking each line. Then she covered the entrance as best she could with the fallen timbers and walked the 3 miles to my store, where she asked me, without explanation, if I had a Norwegian dictionary. I did not. But I had, in the back room with the items nobody had ever purchased, a small Norwegian English religious pamphlet that had arrived with a box of donated goods from a church in Billings some years earlier. I gave it to her. She put it in her coat pocket and left. The sentence took her 11 days to translate. I know this because she came back to compare words against the pamphlet twice more, and the second time she came back she had a piece of paper in her hand with the translation written on it, and she read it to me in the same tone she might have used to read a passage from an agricultural bulletin, careful, factual, giving each word its proper weight. The earth temperature 4 feet down never falls below 48 degrees. This is truth. This is enough. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket with the pamphlet. Who wrote it? I asked her. A man named Lars Eriksson. He had a claim on the east parcel before I did. He left in 1882. Why did he leave? She considered this for a moment. He solved the problem, she said. And then he left before anyone could learn from it. The loneliness, I imagine. It takes people differently. She was quiet for a moment. Then she bought 5 packets of seeds and 25 cents left my counter and went back out into November, and I watched her go and thought she was wasting her money. And that is the last time in this account that I intend to let myself off so easily. She began digging in the second week of November. Not the ruined pit on the east boundary. That structure was beyond repair and oriented 6 degrees off, true south, which she had determined with a compass and confirmed by watching where the noon sun fell on the slope. She chose a site 40 yards to the southwest, where the hillside dropped at an angle she had calculated, using the diagrams and her own measurements, as ideal for a south-facing wall that would intercept the low winter sun directly rather than glancing it. The calculation was simple in principle and demanded precision in execution. At Montana's latitude, she had found the figure in a geography text she had ordered from a bookseller in Billings. The winter sun traveled a low arc across the southern sky, never climbing more than 23 degrees above the horizon at its peak. A vertical wall would catch that sun poorly, the light striking at too shallow an angle to deliver its heat efficiently. A wall tilted back at 45 degrees, meeting the sun's low angle directly, the way you'd angle a mirror to catch a specific reflection, would intercept it squarely, turning weak winter light into something that could actually warm a room. She drew and redrew the angles in her journal until she was satisfied. Then she sharpened her spade and started digging. The work was as plain and hard as any work she had done on the homestead, which is saying something. The topsoil came up easily enough, still loose from the autumn, but below 18 inches she hit the dense glacial clay that underlies most of this valley, and the spade rang against it in the early morning cold like a bell struck reluctantly. She worked from first light until her arms gave out, which in the beginning was around 2 in the afternoon. She ate, she rested, she went back. She was digging a hole 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 4 feet deep into the south-facing slope. 4 feet, exactly as Lars Ericsson had cut into the stone. Deep enough to reach the thermal stability that James had measured, that Choi Hua had pressed her hand against, that the Norwegian had known about and carved into a wall for anyone patient enough to find it and stubborn enough to translate it. The dimensions took 6 weeks. Not because Nora was slow, but because she was one person with one spade, and because the clay did not cooperate, and because November in Montana does not hold still while you work in it. She did not ask anyone for help. There was no one to ask, and she had, by that point in her life, made a quiet and permanent arrangement with necessity that required her to proceed with what she had rather than wait for what she did not. She had 2 good hands and a spade and the correct angle, and the knowledge that 4 feet down the earth held 50 degrees, regardless of what was happening at the surface. She had enough. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of thing you say about a person after everything has worked out, when the struggle has been resolved and the lesson is clear and the reader knows how the story ends. But I watched her come into my store those 6 weeks, and what I saw was not the clean determination of someone whose outcome is already certain. It was dirtier than that. It was a woman with clay under her fingernails and tiredness in her shoulders, buying coffee and nails, and asking me, once, if I had any literature on masonry that she could borrow. I had a pamphlet from the County Extension Service. I gave it to her. She returned it 2 days later with several pages marked. She never explained what she was building. I never asked. In Harlan's Crossing in 1885, a widow digging a large hole on her own land was, at worst, a curiosity, and at best, confirmation of what people had begun to suspect about her temperament. The men who rode past on the creek road looked at the excavation and said what men say when they see a woman doing something they do not understand and cannot immediately classify as either a threat or a request for assistance. They said nothing to her face. Among themselves, in my store and at the livery and after church, they called it the Crazy Widow's Hole, which I am not proud to have laughed at, and which I am telling you now because accuracy requires it. She dug. November became December. The hole reached 4 feet, and at the bottom of it, where no one in Harlan's Crossing had thought to put their hand, the earth was warm. The stones came from the creek. This is the detail I always return to when I try to explain what Nora Holt actually did that winter, because the stones are the part that makes clear what the work cost her. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of her land, the same creek she had fought Harlan Goss to keep, carried granite cobbles in its bed rounded by water and time into shapes that fit the hand well and stacked with reasonable stability, if you knew something about how weight distributed itself through irregular forms. They were good stones for a wall. They were also heavy, and they were 40 yards from the excavation site, and there was one of her and no one else. She moved them in a wheelbarrow, 2 or 3 at a time, through December mud that was trying to decide whether to freeze permanently or remain a navigational inconvenience for the rest of the winter. I know the number of loads because she told me years later, in that way she had of remembering practical details with the precision of someone for whom practical details had been, at critical moments, the difference between a project that succeeded and one that failed. 61 barrow loads, 61 trips between the creek and the excavation over the course of 3 weeks, in weather that dropped to 15 degrees at night and recovered only to the low 30s by midday. She chose granite specifically, and the choosing was not arbitrary. The creek also carried limestone, more of it, in fact, more accessible, closer to the surface and easier to load. But James's geological notes had mentioned, in that careful recording way of his, a failed limestone foundation in the homestead's original outbuilding, the small shed that had been standing when they arrived and had needed to be rebuilt 2 years later. The limestone had fractured along its natural stress lines, James had written, due to repeated freeze and thaw cycles working their way into the mineral grain. He had replaced it with granite from further up the creek. Nora had read this. She went further up the creek. Granite holds heat differently from limestone. This is not a complicated thing to understand if you have held both stones in your hands on a cold afternoon. Limestone gives up its warmth quickly. What it absorbs, it releases fast, which makes it a poor storage medium if what you need is not immediate warmth, but sustained warmth, released slowly through the long, cold hours of a winter night. Granite is slower in both directions. It absorbs heat patiently and holds it with the same patience, releasing it over hours rather than minutes. A granite wall that has spent a clear winter day in the low sun will still be radiating warmth, gently, measurably. At 3 in the morning, Nora stacked her granite walls 3 feet thick at the base, narrowing to 18 inches at the growing bed height. The back wall and the 2 side walls enclosed 3 sides of the pit. The 4th side, facing due south where she had calculated the winter sun would strike the tilted glass wall, remained open, its wooden frame built but unglazed, waiting for glass she had not yet acquired. The frame itself took 2 weeks to build correctly, which is to say it took 4 days to build wrong, 2 days to think about what was wrong with it, and 8 days to take it apart and build it right. The angle was the problem. 45 degrees sounds straightforward until you are building a tilted wall in a pit on a hillside in December in Montana with lumber that is not perfectly straight and corners that must be precisely square or the glass will not seat without gaps. She used a plumb bob that had been James's, a simple lead weight on a string, the oldest measuring device in the history of human construction, and she checked her angles so many times that the frame's main beam has a small worn patch where the string rested repeatedly against the wood. I know this because I saw that beam years later. She pointed it out to me in the way she pointed out all things she considered worth noting, without ceremony, as if the detail spoke well enough for itself. The glass came from the Halverson place. The Halverson homestead was 7 miles east of Harlan's Crossing, abandoned in 1883 when Per Halverson took his family back to Minnesota after 2 consecutive years of poor crops and 1 winter that had been, in his words to anyone who would listen before he left, not survivable by Christian people. The cabin stood empty, the windows intact, 3 of them facing south in the wall that was in the best repair. Nora rode out in the second week of January, determined that the glass was sound. Wavy old glass, thick at one edge and thin at the other, the kind made before the manufacturing process had been fully regularized, but unbroken and clean, and bought it from the county land office for materials value, 60 cents for all 3 windows and their frames. She transported the glass wrapped in blankets in the back of her wagon, driving the 7 miles back to her land at the speed of a person carrying something irreplaceable over roads that wished her ill. She seated each pane in the tilted frame with a bead of pine resin mixed with tallow that she had been rendering and testing for 2 weeks to find a consistency that would flex rather than crack in the cold. The gaps between panes she sealed first with oilcloth cut to width and tacked flat, then sealed again with the resin compound over the tacked edges. When she was finished, she stood back and looked at what she had built. A pit in a hillside, stone walls on 3 sides, a tilted south face of salvaged glass in a pine frame set at 45 degrees to meet the low winter sun. A sod roof of split pine logs covered with 8 inches of packed earth and the dead grass that had been growing on that hillside when she broke it. From above, from any distance, you would not know the structure was there. The hill simply continued being a hill, with a slight rectangular regularity to one section of its south face if you looked at the right angle in the right light. From below, on a clear January morning, the glass caught the sun and held it. The interior, which Nora had not yet planted, was not yet ready to plant, had not yet been proven to do anything, was warmer than the air outside. She measured it with James's thermometer on the first clear day after the glass was seated. Outside, 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, against the back granite wall at noon, 41 degrees. She recorded both numbers in her journal. She did not underline them. She wrote them plainly, the way you write a fact that does not need emphasis, because it is already, in itself, emphatic enough. Then she went inside and began preparing the growing beds. The beds were the part that Choi Hua had, without either of them discussing it in any language the other fully understood, most directly influenced. On the last morning they had walked together in the North Valley, the second week of October, before the ground hardened. Choi Hua had stopped at the edge of the creek and dug with her hands into the accumulated material at the waterline, the black silt and decomposed vegetation that built up in the quiet water at the inside of a bend, where current slowed and dropped what it carried. She had lifted a double handful and held it out. Nora had looked at it. Dense, dark, faintly warm from the sun that hit the exposed creek bank. She had taken some in her own hand and compressed it. It held its shape. She brought it to her nose. Rich, the specific, productive smell of earth that had been building toward something for a long time. She had written that evening, "Creek Bend silt, fine particle, high organic content, holds moisture and warmth together. Note for growing beds." She built the beds from this material layered with composted manure she had been accumulating since the previous spring, and the dark soil from beneath the rotted logs that lay along the north fence line, the oldest logs, the ones that had been lying long enough that the ground under them had gone black and soft and alive with the organisms that meant fertility. She hauled this material into the pit in the wheelbarrow, the same barrow that had moved the granite, and spread it into the stone-walled beds along both interior walls in a layer 8 inches deep. She planted in late January. The seeds went in by the light that came through the south glass wall. Thin winter light, pale and horizontal, nothing like the direct summer sun that seeds prefer, but something. She planted lettuce along the east bed where the morning light would reach first. Kale along the west bed for its tolerance of cold and low light both. Spinach in the middle section where the thermal mass of the back granite wall was strongest. The radishes she planted closest to the glass, where daytime temperatures would be highest. Radishes are quick and forgiving. She needed something quick. She needed early proof, even if only for herself. For 3 weeks, nothing visible happened. This is the period that I think about most when I consider what Nora Holt's winter of 1885 to 1886 actually required of her. The structure was built. The seeds were in the ground. The thermometer showed 41 degrees at noon on clear days, 38 on cloudy ones. There was nothing to do but wait and maintain, checking the resin seals each morning for cracks, monitoring the temperature log, clearing snow from the glass wall after storms so the light could reach through. She waited. The valley outside went about the business of a Montana winter with its usual indifference to human plans and preferences. Then the mold came. She noticed it first on the kale, a fine white powder on the underside of the youngest leaves, the kind of growth that appears when moisture has nowhere to go. The air inside the greenhouse was not cold enough to inhibit growth. It was, apparently, too damp to sustain it cleanly. The interior humidity had been building since she planted warmed air, holding water vapor against the cold glass and releasing it as condensation. The condensation dripping into the growing beds and raising the humidity further in a slow, self-reinforcing cycle that she had not anticipated and had no immediate solution for. She lost half the seedlings in the east bed before she understood what she was losing them to. She wrote in her journal on the evening she cleared the dead plants. 3 days of blank pages, no entries. Then, on the 4th day, one line in handwriting that was tighter than her usual. Ventilation. The problem is ventilation. Find the mechanism. She found it in the physics of air movement, which she knew in the way that anyone who has managed a wood stove in a cold house knows it. Warm air rises, cold air sinks, and if you give them a path to trade places, they will do so without assistance. The greenhouse needed an inlet low on the north wall and an outlet high on the south wall, positioned so that cool, dry air would enter near the floor, warm as it rose through the interior, carry the accumulated moisture up and out before it could condense and settle. The inlet and outlet needed to be small enough that they did not bleed the interior temperature below viability, and large enough that the air exchange was genuine rather than nominal. She had no engineering formula for this. She had clay, a knife, and the specific stubbornness of a person who has already lost one growing bed and cannot afford to lose another. She made the first pair of clay pipes with an interior diameter of 1 inch. Too small. Humidity continued to build, though more slowly. She made a second pair at 2 inches. Better. The temperature dropped 1 degree on average over the following week, which she found acceptable. The humidity stabilized. The remaining seedlings held. She replanted the east bed in the 3rd week of February. The radishes, in the warmest section near the glass, had survived the humidity problem because she had been watering them less than the other beds on the instinct that root vegetables needed less moisture, which had turned out to be correct in a way she had not predicted. On the 21st of February, she pulled the first radish from the earth inside the greenhouse. Outside the glass wall, the temperature was minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, at noon, it was 43. She held the radish for a moment, small, red, unremarkable, the most ordinary vegetable imaginable, and then she ate it standing there on the packed earth floor of her greenhouse, looking out through the tilted glass at the frozen valley, and she wrote in her journal that evening with the matter-of-fact precision that I came to understand over 46 years of knowing her work was her version of joy. First radish, February 21st, 1886. Inside temperature 43 degrees Fahrenheit at noon. Outside temperature minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Ventilation holding, east bed replanted, kale in west bed showing new growth. System is sound. The summer of 1886 passed the way the summer before a catastrophe often passes, generously, almost apologetically, as if the good weather understood what it was setting up for and wanted to leave people with something pleasant to remember. The rains came at the right times. The grass on the high pastures came in thick. Harlan Goss's herd fattened well, and the smaller ranchers in the valley put up hay through July and August with the quiet satisfaction of people who believed they were prepared. In my store, I sold more preserved goods than I had the previous year, and I took this as a sign of something positive. Looking back, it was a sign of anxiety wearing the clothes of optimism. Nora Holt spent that summer expanding. She added a second growing bed against the back wall of the greenhouse, bringing the total growing area to something close to what a serious kitchen garden could provide in a full summer season. She replaced the oilcloth gaps in the south wall with additional salvaged glass she had found when a failed claim 12 miles north was sold for materials. 3 more panes, smaller than the originals, seated with the improved resin compound she had been refining since the previous winter. She noted in her journal that the interior noon temperature on clear days improved by 4 degrees after the last oilcloth was replaced, and that this 4 degrees was the difference in a cold snap between kale that survived and kale that did not. She also built, in August, a seed storage cabinet from pine board and stone set into the back wall of the greenhouse where the temperature was most stable, and she began the careful work of selecting seeds from her strongest plants. Not the biggest, not the most abundant, but the ones that had germinated earliest and grown steadiest in the low winter light and the contained cold of the greenhouse environment. She was beginning, though she did not use this word in her journal, to breed, to select season by season for the specific conditions she was creating. I did not know any of this that summer. I knew she had come in twice to buy additional glass putty and once to ask about the availability of clay pipe fittings, which I did not carry. I knew she was doing something on her land. I did not know what it was becoming. What it was becoming, in the quiet work of those summer months while the rest of the valley fattened its herds and put up its hay and believed it was ready for winter, was a system. Not a single structure, but a method. Not a private solution, but a transmissible one, though nobody yet knew it needed to be transmitted, because nobody yet knew what was coming. September came. The high peaks took their first snow. The cottonwoods went gold. In October, the temperature dropped and did not recover. The first blizzard came on the 14th of November and was followed, before the valley had properly absorbed it, by a second. Harlan Goss rode into my store on the 17th and stood at the counter looking at the inventory with an expression I had not seen on his face in the 30 years I had known him. Not worry exactly, because Harlan Goss did not permit himself the visible expression of worry, but something close to it, something calculating and not comfortable. The supply wagon from Billings had not come. The railroad, he had heard from the telegrapher at the county seat, was prioritizing freight contracts for mining operations and military posts. Civilian goods would follow when capacity allowed. Capacity did not allow for a long time. By the end of November, the temperature had gone to -30, and the snow lay 4 feet deep on level ground and drifted to the eaves of the church on the north side where the wind built it. The Kepler family's cattle, all 14 of them, froze in the pasture on a single night in early December when the temperature dropped to -40, and the barn, which had a poorly fitted door on the north wall that let the wind through, failed to hold enough warmth to keep the animals alive. Thomas Kepler found them in the morning standing exactly as they had been standing when the cold took them, frozen in postures of ordinary bovine patience, which is a thing that, once you have seen it described by a man who lived through it, you do not easily set aside. The Kepler children, 4 of them between ages 2 and 9, had nothing now for the winter but what had been put up in September. Their youngest, a girl named Clara, had been thin going into November. By December, she was thinner. Nora Holt, 3 miles from town, was harvesting kale. I knew it. I had known since March, when Margaret Pryor had come into my store with a look on her face that I can only describe as the expression of someone who has seen something they cannot immediately categorize. She had asked me quietly, as if the question had weight she was not sure she wanted to carry, whether Nora Holt had bought vegetable seeds the previous November. I had confirmed it. Margaret had nodded and bought seeds herself, the first time she had ever bought seeds in November, and I had watched her leave and told myself it was not my business to speculate about other people's growing practices, which was true, and also was the most comfortable explanation for why I was not going to walk 3 miles east and ask Nora Holt what she had built in that hillside. Now it was December of 1886, and the temperature was -30, and the Kepler child was thin, and the supply wagon was not coming, and I was standing behind my counter doing arithmetic that kept producing the same answer no matter how I arranged the numbers. I knew what she had under that hillside. I had known for 9 months. I closed the store at noon on the 4th of January and walked east. I did not tell anyone where I was going. There was no one to tell. My wife had been dead 6 years by then, and the 2 boys, who sometimes helped me with stock, were sensibly indoors on a day when the thermometer outside my door read 29 below zero, and the wind was making serious arguments against any human movement that was not strictly required for survival. I put on every layer I owned, which was considerable, because I was a man whose business required him to order cold weather goods and who had therefore never lacked for them. I stepped out the front door and turned east and walked. The 3 miles to Nora Holt's land took me the better part of an hour. The snow was packed hard enough in most places to walk on without breaking through, but in the low spots between the creek willows it was soft and deep, and I went into my thighs twice and had to work my way out with the specific controlled urgency of a man who understands that panicking in cold of that magnitude is a medical decision as much as an emotional one. The sky was the white-blue color it goes in serious cold, a color that is not quite like any other sky, and that carries in it, for those who know it, a kind of impersonal warning. I walked because of the Kepler child. That is the true answer, and I am going to give it plainly. Clara Kepler was 3 years old and had been losing weight since November, and the doctor who came through Harlan's Crossing every 6 weeks had not come since October, and would not come until the roads allowed it, which at this point appeared to be somewhere in the vicinity of spring. Her mother had been in my store 2 days before and bought the last of my dried beans and looked at my shelves, which were not empty, but were tending in that direction, with an expression I had seen before on the faces of women calculating how to keep children alive on what remained. I had sold her the beans at half price and watched her leave and spent 48 hours telling myself there was nothing more I could do. There was something more I could do. There had been something more I could do for 9 months. I had simply been choosing, with great consistency, not to do it. The smoke from Nora Holt's cabin chimney was visible from half a mile out, a thin, straight column rising in the still, cold air, which told me the wind had dropped and the temperature was, relatively speaking, stable. I followed it to her door and knocked. She opened it without apparent surprise, which I later came to understand was characteristic of her. She noticed things at a distance and had usually made her decisions about them before they arrived. She looked at me. She looked at the cold behind me. "Come in," she said. Her kitchen was warm in the specific way of a room that has been heated by a wood stove through a serious winter, a warmth that has soaked into the walls and the furniture and exists as a kind of accumulated fact rather than a current event. She had coffee on the stove. She poured me a cup without asking and set it in front of me and sat down across the table and waited while I collected myself from the walk. I told her about the Kepler child. I told her about the supply wagon and the railroad and the state of my shelves. I told her that 3 other families in the valley had begun rationing in December, and that 2 of them had children under 5. I did not tell her that I had known about her greenhouse since March and had said nothing, because I thought she already knew that, and saying it out loud in her kitchen would have been less an apology than a request for absolution I had not earned. She listened without interrupting. This was another characteristic quality. She gave information the space to be fully delivered before she responded to it, which is rarer than it should be and more useful than most people understand. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I won't feed them," she said. I had expected something, but not that. I started to speak and she held up one hand, not impatiently, but with the finality of someone who has already thought through the objection being raised. "I will teach them. Anyone who comes here and wants to understand what I've built and how to build it themselves, I will give them every hour they need. I will give them seeds from my own stock and instruction on how to save more seeds from what they grow. I will walk to their land and help them find the right slope and calculate the right angle. But I will not simply carry baskets of food to people and let them eat through the winter without knowing how to feed themselves next winter and the winter after. She paused. Outside, the cold pressed against the window glass and left its breath there. Dependency is not survival, Edmund. It looks like survival. It feels like it for a season. But it leaves people in the same position the following November, waiting for someone else to solve the problem that they are entirely capable of solving themselves if someone will only show them how. I won't do to them what this valley has done with winter for 20 years. I won't let them keep deciding it's a condition instead of a problem. I sat with this for a moment. I thought about arguing. I thought about the Kepler child and whether she had the luxury of a philosophical position. Then I thought about what Nora Holt had built alone in a frozen hillside over the course of 3 months with 61 barrow loads of granite and 60 cents worth of salvaged glass and the carved inscription of a lonely Norwegian who had solved the problem and left before anyone could learn from it. I thought, she has earned the right to her terms. What do you need from me? I asked. Bring me people who are willing to learn, not people who want to be rescued. People who will come here, understand what they're looking at, and go home and build. I went back to town. I delivered her message as plainly as she had delivered it to me to the 6 families I thought were most likely to hear it correctly. I told them there would be no charity and no performance and no asking Nora Holt to justify herself to anyone. I told them she would teach everything she knew to anyone who came ready to learn it. 5 families came. The Keplers, because they had no choice and knew it. The Pryors, because Margaret had already half-believed for 9 months and was ready to fully believe now. 3 others, whose names I will not record here because 2 of them are still living, and asked me, when I began telling this story publicly in my old age, not to include them, and I am honoring that request while noting that their reluctance to be named is itself a piece of information about what kind of courage it took, in Harlan's Crossing in January of 1887, to walk to Nora Holt's land and admit you needed what she had. She walked them down to the greenhouse on a morning when the thermometer read 27 below. She opened the door. The new door she had built in October from pine board with a rope and pulley latch she had designed to operate with mittened hands. And they went in, all 11 adults in various configurations of wool and leather and the accumulated improvised cold-weather gear of frontier people who had spent years solving the problem of winter clothing with whatever came to hand. They stood in the interior, which was 43 degrees at noon, and they looked at the green plants growing in the stone-walled beds. Nobody spoke for a long moment. I have tried over the years to describe this silence accurately, and the best I have managed is this. It was the silence of people revising something fundamental, not their opinion of Nora Holt, though that was happening too, something more basic than that. The silence of people discovering that a thing they had classified as impossible was simply something they had not yet done. Thomas Kepler crouched down and put his hand flat on the soil of the nearest growing bed. He left it there for a while. Then he looked up at Nora. "Show me how you built the walls," he said. She showed him. She showed all of them, methodically and without condescension, moving through the structure from the foundation logic to the glass angle, to the ventilation pipes, to the growing bed composition. She explained why south and what south meant in terms of winter sun geometry at their latitude. She explained why granite and not limestone, and how you knew the difference in the creek bed. She explained the ventilation problem she had encountered and solved, and the clay pipe dimensions she had arrived at through 3 iterations of failure, because she believed, and said so plainly, that knowing where a design had failed was as important as knowing where it had succeeded. She gave each family seeds from her storage cabinet. Not a gift, she told them, a loan that would be repaid in saved seeds at the end of the following growing season, with enough surplus to share with the next family who needed to start. She walked to the Kepler land the following day in 20 below cold and helped Thomas Kepler identify the correct south-facing slope and calculate the wall angle and mark the excavation boundaries with stakes she had cut from willow branches that morning. She walked to the Pryor land the day after that and the Anderson land the day after that. Within 3 weeks, 4 excavations were underway in the valley of Harlan's Crossing. Within 6 weeks, the first of them was producing radishes. Harlan Goss came alone on a morning in the last week of January and knocked on the greenhouse door. He had lost 61 cattle by then, more than half his herd, and the financial arithmetic of that loss, which he had been calculating with the same relentless precision that Nora applied to temperature logs and wall angles, had arrived at a number he could not make comfortable no matter how he arranged it. He was 62 years old, and the fortune and position he had spent 30 years building in this valley had been materially diminished by a single winter that he had believed, in October, that he was prepared for. He was not a man who said he was wrong. In 62 years he had not said those words to anyone, and he was not going to say them now. But he was a man who understood when the evidence was conclusive, that evidence was conclusive. And the evidence of that January, the dead cattle in the frozen pasture, the depleted stores, the families coming back from Nora Holt's land with seeds and slope calculations, and the specific purposeful look of people who have just been handed the solution to a problem they had decided was permanent, was as conclusive as anything he had encountered. He stood inside the greenhouse and looked at the growing beds for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at the south glass wall and at the angle of it, and at the way the winter sun was working through the glass and falling on the granite back wall and doing the slow, patient work that Nora had designed it to do. "The angle," he said. "How did you calculate it?" She told him. She used the same words she had used with the Keplers and the Pryors: latitude, winter sun arc, intercept angle, 45 degrees as the working solution for this valley at this elevation. She showed him the diagram she had drawn in her journal, which had started as a copy of Lars Ericsson's Carved Lines and had become, through 2 winters of refinement, something more precise and more thoroughly tested. He looked at the diagram for a while. "I'll need more glass than I can salvage locally," he said. "There's a glazier in Billings who ships in the spring. I have his address. I'll pay for enough to build 2, one on my South Hill and one for the Kepler place." He did not look at her when he said this. He was looking at the diagram. "That's generous," Nora said, in a tone that was neither warm nor cold, simply accurate. "It's practical," he said. "Kepler can't afford glass. His cattle are gone. If his family goes under, that's one less working homestead in this valley, and this valley needs every working homestead it has." This was true. It was also not the whole truth, and I think both of them knew it. But Harlan Goss was a man who had never in his life said more than the practical minimum of what he meant, and Nora Holt was a woman who did not require people to say more than they were capable of saying. "The address is in my desk," she said. "I'll write it down for you." He came back in July with 4 men and a wagon load of glass and good pine lumber, and he built on the south slope above Nora's original greenhouse a second structure larger than hers, with 3 times the glass and walls that were, she later told me, the finest stonework she had seen in the valley. He spent 4 days on it. He measured the wall angle 3 times on the final day. When the 4 days were done, he stood outside the completed structure for a moment in the July afternoon light, and then he walked to where Nora was working in her kitchen garden and stopped. "The south wall," he said, 45 degrees. I measured it 3 times. "I'll look at it this afternoon," she said. "It's right," he said. She looked at him. "I expect it is," she said. He went back to his wagon. He did not look back. She wrote in her journal that evening, in the plain handwriting she used for facts that required no elaboration: "H.G. built. South wall, 45 degrees, sufficient." By the spring of 1887, there were 14 solar pit greenhouses in the valley of Harlan's Crossing. Not one family that built one went hungry in the remainder of that winter. Clara Kepler, who had been thin in December, was picking up weight by March on a diet that included fresh kale 3 times a week. Margaret Pryor's daughter, the infant she had been nursing when Nora first brought her a basket of greens in March of the previous year, grew up in a household that kept a greenhouse as a matter of annual practice, the same way it kept a root cellar and a woodpile. That daughter built her own greenhouse at 22. She taught her daughter to build one at 50. The method traveled beyond the valley before the year was out. I know this because I began, in the autumn of 1887, to receive seed orders in October and November from names I did not recognize at addresses I had to look up on the county map. Someone had told someone who had told someone else, and the calendar of growing in this part of Montana had shifted, quietly and permanently, without any announcement or ceremony. Nora Holt continued teaching for the rest of her life. She charged nothing. She required only that each person taught would teach 2 others, which meant that the knowledge compounded in the way that good knowledge does when it is freed from the idea of private ownership. The apprenticeship she ran informally from her kitchen table in 1887 had become, by the turn of the century, a recognized program that drew students from Wyoming and Idaho, and eventually from states further east whose agricultural bulletins had begun to carry descriptions of the solar pit method attributed, in the careful passive voice that agricultural bulletins favor, to a practitioner in the Montana Territory. She developed, through 30 years of careful seed selection, a lettuce variety that germinated at 38 degrees Fahrenheit and grew in the low horizontal light of a Montana January without bolting. It was never formally registered. It has no Latin designation in any seed catalog. It spread through the valley and beyond it by the method of one neighbor giving seeds to another with the instruction to save some back at the end of the season, which is the oldest method of agricultural transmission in human history and the most reliable one. People in this valley call it the winter green. She died in 1924 at 75 years old in the house she had shared with James for 2 years and alone for 41. She was found by her nearest neighbor, Margaret Pryor's daughter, as it happened, sitting in the chair beside the south window of her kitchen, her journal open on the table in front of her and a packet of seeds beside it. The last entry in the journal was a temperature log. Inside the greenhouse that morning, 47 degrees. Outside, -3. The system was sound. I went to the funeral. Most of the valley went. People came from the settlements she had taught, and from settlements those settlements had taught, and from the agricultural college in Bozeman where her methods had been studied and documented by researchers who had understood, better than most of us closer to it, what she had actually accomplished. 400 people stood on a frozen hillside in January to bury a woman who had spent the better part of her adult life being treated as an inconvenience by the community she eventually saved. I stood in the back, the way I have always stood when something important was happening, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid accountability. And I thought about the things I should have said and did not, and the questions I should have asked and did not, and the 25 cents I had taken for 5 packets of seeds on a Thursday in November of 1885, while thinking that the woman buying them was wasting her money. Alice Marsh has not written anything for several minutes. She is looking at the 5 seed packets I have placed on the counter between us. Nora's original purchase, which I found in a box of old receipts 3 days ago when I heard Alice was coming, and which I have been carrying in my coat pocket since then without fully understanding why until now. The packets are empty. Whatever seeds they once held were planted in a frozen hillside in the winter of 1885 and are still, in some botanical and practical sense, growing. What happened to Choi Hua? Alice asks. I have been waiting for this question. I have been both waiting for it and dreading it, because it requires me to say something honestly that I have been saying inadequately for a long time. She moved north before the decade was out. I don't know where. I don't know what became of her. I pause. What I know is that without her, Nora would not have known where to look. The warm ground, the south-facing slope, the principle that the earth remembers heat even when the surface has forgotten it. Choi Hua's hand in that soil was the beginning of everything that followed. 14 greenhouses in this valley, the Winter Green, the students from Bozeman, the families in Wyoming and Idaho who never went hungry in January. All of it traces back to a woman whose name most of those people never heard.